Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who prepared for today's episode by scrolling on Twitter, Reddit, and eating some Reese's Pieces. And
someone who, despite saying at various points as a kid, I'll never be a teacher or a lawyer, those are the worst jobs ever, has done both of those things. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
But then come back. Please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional and facts could change at any time. Do your own research. All right, Martin. Today we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to follow up on our first episode where we talked about gerrymandering, which, as we discussed, is often racially motivated.
And if you haven't listened to our first episode, please go back and check it out.
Martin, what do you know about the Voting Rights Act? And listeners, in addition to being a law nerd, Martin is a big fan of Jeopardy, so I wouldn't be surprised if he knows a lot about it.
Honestly, right before we were recording, I started thinking about it, and I don't think I could confidently say anything about the Voting Rights Act. I really did prepare for today's episode, like scrolling Twitter and Reddit right before we started recording and eating my Reese's Pieces. But yeah, I mean, I assume it granted voting rights for Black people, like, because historically Black people in America have been disenfranchised. So I assume it protected states, probably in the South, from or protected people from states in the South enacting laws that didn't allow people to vote.
That's a fair summary. And we're going to get into in greater detail what the Voting Rights Act covers. But because I know you love Jeopardy and all things trivia, I also want to ask you, do you know which president signed it into law?
I think it was Lyndon Johnson.
Okay. You did not fully put respect on his name with the Lyndon B. Johnson, but yes.
B. Johnson, LBJ.
That is the correct president. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. Didn't he, I mean, despite the circumstances when he came into office, he actually kind of continued the legacy of civil rights from that JFK was kind of building. And surprisingly, this old white guy from Texas actually was pretty progressive on civil rights, right?
I mean, he did help us get to the point where we have this monumental piece of legislation. So yeah, I think that's fair to say. Not a perfect person, but who is? But yes, that is right, that he did continue a lot of the work that President Kennedy had initiated. And as we start to get into the topic of today, I want us to take a moment to celebrate because the Voting Rights Act turned 59 this month. Ooh. We're recording in August 2024. So, Martin, I can picture various friends of mine singing the Black version of Happy Birthday right now in honor of this very momentous occasion.
Happy birthday. Am I supposed to start singing? Is that what you were?
You know, I'm
not Black.
I actually, as I was putting this script together, I just left a placeholder for Martin's reaction because I was very curious what you were going to come up with.
What that made me think of was when your balsa friends were singing to me at one of your other balsa friends' wedding because it happened to turn my birthday after midnight.
Yes, that's
a specific memory I could think of.
So I think that's perfect. And for listeners who are wondering what BALSA is, it is one of the student organizations at many law schools, the Black Law Students Association. And Martin is alluding to a time when various of my friends from said organization, we post-graduation had gotten together at a wedding, and that wedding coincided with Martin's birthday. And so there was singing and dancing and fanfare. I also want to point out that for listeners who might be curious about what the Black version of Happy Birthday even is, that would be the Stevie Wonder version. And don't let the internet tell you anything different. Go listen to it after this episode. All right, so back to the pod. We'll kick things off with some history. Some listeners might know this part well, and in fact may have lived through it. I really want us to be grounded in knowing that this important history was not too long ago. As some context, my parents were school age when the Voting Rights Act became law. Martin, any reactions to just the recency of that?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's something that we should have studied in school, and there are countless examples of it wasn't that long ago that always, I think, hits home. So that's super important fact, and it's crazy to think about your parents living in the world that they had to live in.
Like any reasonable person of our era, yes, even lawyers, I started my research for this episode on, drumroll please, Wikipedia. I ran across one really interesting fact. Martin, can you read what the Department of Justice said about the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, the Department of Justice said the Voting Rights Act, quote, has been called the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress.
Thanks. Let's talk more about why it's so important in the context leading up to its ratification. Listeners, a lot of this summary comes from the National Archives website, archives.gov. This is a short podcast, so we're not going to dive super deep into all that led to the Voting Rights Act. So like we always say, do your own research. Martin, what would you guess is the primary purpose of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, I also just happened to pull up Wikipedia as a layman. But yeah, again, I think it was just securing the right to vote for Black men, because I think that was like kind of the first evolution to voting how it is today, where every person should be able to vote, asterisk.
It's a solid guess, and we're gonna dive in and kind of go piece by piece. So to start, the text of the law itself says, an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Civics history moment, Martin. What's the 15th Amendment? Listeners, I need you to know that Martin is consulting his pocket constitution.
Ooh, that's a good cue. I was going to Wikipedia. Let's see, the 15th Amendment. First, it's kind of crazy that there has to be a congressional act to what they say enforce the 15th Amendment. Like,
there doesn't have to be, but
exactly. So, this is probably a whole other can of worms. Like, isn't the passing of the 15th Amendment, shouldn't that make it the law of the land? I guess up for interpretation into individual precedent or instances to debate. But
so as you're gathering the text, just to respond, yes, completely agree. But then one would also think, did we even need the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Because, wow, this whole President Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation thing, that should have done it. But nope, it did not. Pocket Constitution says?
Handy Pocket Constitution says Amendment 15. There's an asterisk here, which says it was ratified February 3rd, 1870. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So I guess, does that tie it back? Congress can use their power to enforce the article by this appropriate legislation, i.e. the Voting Rights Act.
It's true. And it gives the sort of extra, a term that lawyers love to use, belt and suspenders, if a sort of executive act doesn't do enough. But again, should this be necessary is a great question. Martin, as our resident layman, can you break this amendment down into layperson's terms?
Yeah, I can do my best here. It seems pretty straightforward, right? It says if you're a citizen of the United States, either the federal government, the United States itself, or by any state within the United States, cannot deny or abridge. So, I don't know, limit or, gosh, I'm trying to think of how else, restrict your ability to vote. And it specifies on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which is blowing my mind reading that out loud right now, because that's not how it works in the States. Gosh, yeah. And then the second part we kind of touched on is that Section 2 is that Congress can pass legislation. I think also, side comment without going too far, without a reaction to that, the fact that it was ratified in 1870, right? We're talking Civil War times, and the Voting Rights Act was mid 60s, so 100 years later is when Congress finally used their power to enforce. And in simple language, right? It just seems kind of like we talked about in episode 1, which again, if you haven't listened, go back and check it out. It seems like that is such of the founding principle of the United States, is that citizens have the right to vote, right? But I think as we learn history, we learn more and more that isn't necessarily the case, nor has it been.
So I just want to let listeners know I've been nodding extremely intensely as Martin's been giving his layperson summary. The fact that we're even having this podcast episode, let alone that we had to have the Voting Rights Act, let alone that we had to have the 15th Amendment, says a lot for those who are less familiar with United States history. And I also want to circle back to a point that Martin made about the 15th Amendment enabling Black men or men of color to vote. Also, for those who are not familiar with United States history, it took the 19th Amendment to permit women to be able to vote. So there's that. Things move real slowly in terms of evolutions in political history and developments. That said, so Martin's commenting also on just the timing between the 15th Amendment's passage and then the Voting Rights Act. Martin, why do you think it was that almost 100 years passed for us to get to the Voting Rights Act?
Oh boy, here we go. This is actually something that I feel a little bit more able to speak to because, as we mentioned in episode 1, we have read through the Equal Justice Initiative's published articles or little books.
Reports.
Yes. Thank you. We've read Equal Justice Initiative's reports on various histories of the United States, and particularly with Reconstruction. And I think what I learned and what I took away from those reports is that despite having these moments, as we said in episode 1, where racism was over and everything's good now, I think every step of the way, every victory, we saw nothing but a backlash. So that's why I think it took 100 years, because yeah, sure, Civil War was over. Okay, then we had Reconstruction to try to build back the states, change their economy from being slave labor, based on slave labor, and protecting the rights that were just fought for. And then there's just always been this pushback.
Well said. Very well said. And so that folks can get some more color as to exactly what was happening leading up to 1965, check out the archives link that we're going to include in our resources. At the time, Black folks in the South were facing tremendous obstacles to voting, including poll taxes, literacy taxes, and other bureaucratic restrictions to deny them the right to vote. So that was a slight paraphrase there, but, you know, folks had to pay. They had to prove they could read. They had to prove their lineage was of a certain type in order to vote.